In the quiet folds of the night, where secrets breathe and shadows whisper their truths, two names emerged from the mist: Mossad and MI6. They were not born from glory, tore from greed, but from necessity, from a world trembling on the edge of chaos, where silence could mean survival, and a whisper could alter history. Their stories are not loud, not boastful. They are the hum of midnight engines, the rustle of coded letters, the footsteps that vanish just before dawn. Tonight, as the world slows and sleep begins to draw near, let us drift through time and shadow to uncover how these two silent forces reshaped the world beneath the surface of what we see. If these stories carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side to a quiet companion beneath the soft light of memory, where history breathes not in textbooks, but in whispers. The birth of shadows. The night was heavy with rain. It was the kind of night that seemed to erase the edges of the world. Streets swallowed by fog, clocks ticking slower, and the air humming with uncertainty. In that stillness, two seeds of silence were planted, one in the weary heart of Britain, and another in the trembling hope of a nation not yet born. MI6 came first, not as a grand organization, but as a collection of watchful minds in the early 20th century. Britain stood alone at times, surrounded by empires and rising storms. And in those uncertain years, the need for quiet eyes became clear. They called it the Secret Intelligence Service, though even the name seemed too loud for what it truly was. It was an idea born of necessity, a whisper formed to hear other whispers. Its agents moved unseen through embassies, ports, and drawing rooms, carrying not weapons, but questions. Across the sea, another shadow waited to form, one that would carry the weight of survival itself. Mossad was still years away, its birth tied to the dawn of a fragile new country called Israel. Yet even before it had a name, the spirit that would become Mossad lived in the hearts of people who had seen too much loss. They understood that peace, for them, would never be given. It would have to be protected, quietly, forever. Both agencies were born not from ambition, but from fear, a rare and precious kind of fear, the kind that breeds clarity. For Britain, it was the fear of losing an empire to chaos. For Israel, it was the fear of ceasing to exist. And so each turned to the same ancient wisdom, that in the silence of the night, there is power in knowing what others do not. The early years of MI6 were uncertain and strange. It was not yet the sleek, refined agency the world imagines now. It was raw, untested, made of men who were poets and clerks, linguists and soldiers. Some carried briefcases with false names. Others slipped across borders with nothing but charm and intuition. Their world was one of coded letters, invisible ink, and meetings in fog-soaked streets. They learned slowly that information, not armies, could alter the course of history. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the first sparks of Mossad's spirit flickered in secret gatherings. Jewish agents under British mandate Palestine, working undercover, to bring their people home. They smuggled refugees, gathered intelligence, and moved between cultures with an uncanny grace. There were no grand officers, no titles, no medals, only a single promise that their people would never again be blind to danger. It is strange to think that the fate of nations once hung on such fragile human moments. A letter slid across a cafe table, a glance exchanged in a crowded train station, a coded word on a static-filled radio. But it was from these moments that both MI6 and Mossad found their strength in the shadowed corridors of London. MI6 learned to navigate the politics of power, to influence without being seen, to listen where others spoke too loudly. In the sunburnt streets of Tel Aviv, Mossad's forerunners learned to survive by blending in, by making silence their strongest weapon. One was a creature of empire, the other a child of exile. Yet both discovered that in the world of espionage, nationality is an illusion. Only truth and deception remain. As the 1930s approached, the world grew darker, the storms louder, and both shadows, British and Jewish, grew restless. They could feel history turning beneath their feet, an invisible shift pulling them toward the inevitable war. Neither could stop it, but both could prepare, and so they did, quietly, patiently, while the world above debated peace and power. The unseen world beneath it was already at work. Networks were woven, codes were crafted, alliances formed in silence. It was in those years that the rhythm of espionage began to change. No longer just the plaything of diplomats and dreamers, but the unseen backbone of global survival. For the first time, secrecy itself became a form of warfare. And as dawn broke on a new and terrible age, the two youngest watchers of the world, Mossad's spirit still unshaped, MI6 standing at the edge of modernity, were ready to step into the darkness, because in the end, espionage was never about shadows. It was about light, the thin, fragile light of knowledge that could keep chaos at bay. And so, beneath the roar of approaching war, two silent guardians took their first breath. And as the night deepened, their journey moved quietly forward, the war that taught them to listen. The night before the war broke out, London slept uneasily. The air hung thick with the weight of what everyone already knew, that peace had become too thin to hold. Beneath the flickering lamps and quiet doorways, a new kind of soldier was already waking. Not one who carried a rifle, but one who carried silence. MI6. Still a young and restless creature, learned that survival was not about power, but perception. As Europe began to burn, they realized something profound, that wars are not only fought in trenches or skies, but in minds. Information became ammunition, and listening, real listening, became an act of war. In smoky rooms, tucked behind embassy walls, MI6's quiet thinkers began their invisible battle. They tapped phone lines, read intercepted cables, watched movements no one else noticed. Each scrap of information was a pulse in the larger body of war. Each coded message was a heartbeat, bound, soon, They learned to hear it, the rhythm of danger moving beneath the surface of nations across the continent. The German war machine grew, precise and merciless, and yet its perfection hid flaws, patterns, habits, human weaknesses. MI6 learned to find them, one by one, through patience rather than violence. They built webs of informants across occupied Europe, weaving connections so fragile they could snap with a single misplaced word. But within that fragility was beauty, the quiet beauty of trust, built in darkness. They listened to the airwaves that carried coded German messages, the Enigma transmissions, sharp and clinical, pulsing through the static of war. It was in this rhythm of numbers that MI6 found its greatest ally, Bletchley Park, the mind's battlefield. Their mathematicians and dreamers worked not with guns, but with logic and intuition. Alan Turing, young and reserved, led a small team of listeners who turned sound into salvation. The decoding of Enigma was more than an achievement. It was a moment of awakening proof that even in wars, chaos, intellect, and patience could prevail. The war had taught them to listen, not just to enemies, but to patterns, to silence itself. And in doing so, MI6 learned that true power lies in knowing before acting, in understanding before striking. Meanwhile, in the shadows of a world at war, the seeds of Mossad's spirit began to stir. Though Israel did not yet exist, Jewish operatives scattered across Europe and the Middle East had already begun their own listening war. They moved through occupied territories, posing as traders, translators, or travelers, gathering whispers of camps, deportation, massacres. They knew that each message sent, each detail shared, could save lives unseen. Their task was not just to inform, it was to remember, to bear witness to the silence of millions, so the truth would never vanish into the smoke of war. In that shared silence, one British, one Jewish, a bond of spirit began to form. Both were learning the same lesson, that knowledge, however small, was sacred, and that in an age of death and noise, to hear what others ignored was a form of grace. As the war stretched on, MI6 began to move beyond mere observation. Deception became their new language. They mastered it like poets, crafting stories so believable they reshaped reality. They fed false intelligence to Nazi command, built entire armies on paper, and misled the enemy into chasing ghosts. The most famous of these illusions would come to be known as Operation Mincemeat, a story almost too strange to believe. MI6 released the body of a dead man into the sea, dressed him in a British officer's uniform, with fake documents suggesting Allied landings in Greece. The Germans believed every word. Their armies shifted south, and in that space of deception, the Allies took Sicily. It was not a single victory. It was proof that words, too, could win wars. This quiet mastery of illusion, the ability to listen deeply and then to mislead elegantly, became S6's art. They were no longer just collectors of secrets. They were sculptors of reality itself. and the world would never be the same again. In Palestine, far from the European front, Jewish agents watched and learned. They studied British methods, sometimes working beside them, sometimes in silence. They saw how listening could protect, how deception could defend. For them, this was not just strategy. It was survival practice for a homeland yet unborn. And when the war ended, the world did not fall quiet. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound. In that stillness, the agents who had listened through chaos now had to listen to something deeper, the haunting echo of what had been lost. The war had taught them all how to hear, but it had also left them burdened with what they had heard. MI6, though victorious, carried the knowledge of horrors uncovered. The Jewish operatives carried the grief of what they could not prevent. And somewhere in that quiet aftermath, the paths of Mossad and MI6 began to draw closer to watchers who understood that silence was no longer safety, but warning. The world was entering a new kind of war now, one without declarations, without uniforms, without end. The Cold War would not thunder, whisper, and the ones who had learned to listen would now become its architect. And so, as the last echoes of World War II faded into night, the quiet watchers prepared for a new dawn, one filled not with peace, but with the soft, endless hum of secrets, and the shadows deepened once more. Birth of the Israeli state and the need for eyes. The night before Israel was born, the world held its breath. There was no grand trumpet, no glorious unveiling, only the sound of papers being signed, the hum of radios carrying the news, and the echo of footsteps in streets that had waited too long for belonging. In May of 1948, Israel came into being, small, fragile, uncertain. Surrounded by enemies and doubt, it was a miracle made of dust and defiance. And in the quiet heart of this newborn nation, one truth glimmered like a secret beneath the surface. To survive, Israel would need eyes that could see beyond the horizon. There were no standing armies large enough to defend her, no borders secure enough to trust. But what the young nation lacked in size, it made up for in understanding, the understanding that knowledge was survival. In that delicate balance between hope and fear, the need for an intelligence network became as vital as air dot at first. There was no Mossad, only fragments, scattered networks of spies and smugglers, resistance operatives who had learned the art of invisibility during the war. They called it Shah, the intelligence wing of the Haganah, the underground Jewish defense organization. These early watchers were farmers by day and secret keepers by night. They traded information through coded notes, carried messages in the seams of clothing, memorized maps of enemy positions as they plowed fields under the sun. Each whisper they gathered was a lifeline, each intercepted plan a breath of safety. When the state of Israel finally declared independence, it was as if all those hidden watchers exhaled together. But even in that first breath of freedom, danger surrounded them like smoke. The neighboring nations moved quickly. armies assembling at her borders before the ink on the declaration had dried dot. And so, intelligence became not an afterthought, but an instinct. The government formed the Institute for Coordination, which would soon be renamed the Mossad, the larger bet, the Institute for Immigration B. Its first purpose was humanitarian, to bring Jewish refugees home from war-torn Europe. But behind that mission lay something deeper, the gathering of intelligence by the study of threats and the quiet building of a defense not made of walls, but of awareness, in its earliest form. Mossad was little more than a few rooms, a few phones, and a handful of men and women who carried the weight of an entire nation's survival in their briefcases. There were no vast budgets, no foreign offices, no elaborate training schools, only faith and fear and the will to endure. They learned quickly that Israel's survival depended not only on courage, but on foresight. They could not afford to react. They had to anticipate. Every piece of information, no matter how small, could save lives. A rumor in Cairo, a shipment in Damascus, a voice caught on a radio frequency. It all mattered, and so the agents of the young Mossad learned to listen to the world with their hearts open and their hands steady. But theirs was not a cold profession. It was deeply human, built on emotion, empathy, and memory. Many of Mossad's early operatives were survivors of Europe's darkest years. They carried with them not only scars, but the clarity that comes from loss. They knew that the world could turn its back on truth, and so they vowed that Israel never would. Every mission carried the same quiet promise: never again. In the early years, Mossad's reach extended not just across borders, but across time, tracing the ghosts of Nazi fugitives, listening for whispers of weapons deals, watching for alliances forming in the shadows. The agency's network spread through embassies, shipping companies, and consulates. Their methods were simple, sometimes improvised, but always guided by purpose. Meanwhile, MI6, older, more established, watched with a kind of distant fascination. Britain's empire was fading, its global influence shrinking, yet its intelligence web remained vast. Some within MI6 viewed Mossad's birth as the rise of a younger sibling, audacious, unpolished, but fiercely intelligent. And quietly, cooperation began to bloom. British and Israeli agents met in secret, trading insights about Arab movements, Soviet interests, and European networks of surviving Nazi officers. Poor to MI6. It was a way to retain influence in a volatile region. For Mossad, it was a chance to learn from a master of quiet wars. But even as they shared secrets, the two agencies were defined by their differences. MI6 valued patience, diplomacy, and subtle manipulation. Mossad valued precision, resilience, and heart. For the Israelis, espionage was not an art, it was survival. For the British, it was a craft refined over centuries. By and somewhere between those two philosophies, the modern world of intelligence began to take shape. Through the 1950s, as Israel strengthened its footing Mossad grew into something extraordinary. Its agents learned to blend into cities that would never welcome them. Cairo, Beirut, Damascus, Tehran. They listened not with machines, but with instinct. They built identities so convincing that even their own reflections might have doubted them. They were teachers, mechanics, diplomats, lovers living double lives with grace and exhaustion. Some never returned home. Some disappeared into the folds of history. Their names erased, but their echoes eternal. Mossad's quiet triumphs were often invisible to the world. Smuggled weapons for survival, early warnings of attacks, delicate manipulations that prevented wars before they began. And all of it was done not from power, but from the tender ache of necessity. In London, MI6 took note. They saw in Mossad a reflection of something they had almost forgotten: purpose stripped bare. While British intelligence was burdened by bureaucracy, Mossad operated on instinct and trust. They were not bound by tradition, but by urgency. In time, the two agencies would become mirrors of each other, different in style, united in spirit. But for now, Mossad was still a growing flame, learning to control its own brilliance. And as the 1950s drew to a close, the Middle East grew restless again. The world was entering a new kind of tension, not of open war, but of silent rivalry. The Cold War's shadow stretched across deserts and oceans alike, and beneath that shadow, two agencies, one ancient, one young, prepared once more to listen. For the war to come would not be fought in daylight. It would be fought in the places where whispers live. And so, as the stars shifted over Jerusalem and London alike, the watchers stayed awake, listening, waiting, building the unseen future. And so, the night deepened, and their journey moved quietly forward. The Eichmann pursued. The air in Buenos Aires was thick with summer dust, ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of air that carries laughter, markets, and music. And yet, somewhere beneath that sunlight, a man lived who carried the weight of millions of silences. His name was Adolf Eichmann. To the world, he had vanished after the war, another ghost swallowed by history's darkness. But to Mossad, his name was a wound that would not close. Eichmann had been the architect of logistics in the Nazi machinery of death, the man who had organized deportations, who turned human life into train schedules and lists. He had not killed with his hands, but with his precision. And for Mossad, whose agents carried the memories of Auschwitz and Treblinka in their bones, his survival was an unbearable whisper. The operation to find him began not with fury, but with quiet faith. In 1957, a German prosecutor passed along a rumor that Eichmann might be living under a false name in Argentina. The message found its way to Israel. Small, uncertain, yet enough to stir something deep within Mossad's core. The agency's director, Issa Harel, understood immediately what was at stake. This was not politics. This was not revenge. This was history calling. And Mossad, still young and raw, would be the one to answer. The hunt began in silence. Agents were sent across continents under names not their own. Engineers, tourists, businessmen. They combed through neighborhoods in Buenos Aires, following threads so thin they could break with a breath. Months passed, leads vanished, hope flickered dirt. Then, one evening, an agent sat in a modest neighborhood called San Fernando, watching a house at the edge of a dirt road. There, a man arrived home from work. He was older, quieter, unassuming. His children called him Papa. His papers named him Ricardo Clement. But his gestures, the way he adjusted his glasses, the way he spoke, carried ghosts of something else the watchers knew. The air itself seemed to know. It took months more of waiting, listening, confirming. Every detail mattered. Mossad could not act until they were certain. Eichmann was protected by a government indifferent to justice and a society willing to forget. So they built their plan like poets, with precision, rhythm, and grace. The team that would capture him arrived in Argentina disguised as mechanics and diplomats. Their cover stories were simple. Their tools were ordinary. Their mission was extraordinary. On the evening of May 11th, 1960, as the last light faded and the street lamps began to hum, Eichmann stepped off a bus and walked down a quiet lane toward his home. A black car waited nearby, engine idling softly. The agents moved like shadows, swift, silent. Synchronized .1 reached out. A brief struggle, a muffled cry, and then silence. No gunfire, no spectacle, only the sound of footsteps fading into the night. They held him for days in a safe house, under a false name, pretending to be part of an airline crew. The plan was almost impossible to smuggle him out of Argentina without a single alarm raised. And yet, through patience and timing, they did. When Eichmann arrived in Israel days later, hidden aboard an El flight, the nation felt the world shift. For the first time in history, the victims would bring their executioner to justice, not through vengeance, but through law. The trial began in 1961. The courtroom was silent, save for the voice of Eichmann, flat and bureaucratic. But outside those walls, survivors listened, tears in their eyes, as the world finally spoke their truth aloud. Mossad had not just captured a man, they had captured silence itself and made it speak. For the agents who had risked everything, the operation changed more than their agency. It changed their souls. They had looked evil in the face, not monstrous, not grand, but ordinary. And that ordinariness frightened them most. When Eichmann was sentenced to death, there was no celebration. Only a stillness, deep, reflective, heavy. Mossad's mission had ended, but its meaning would echo forever by MI6. Watching from across the sea, recognized something profound in what Mossad had done. It was not an act of dominance. It was a reclamation of dignity, the kind of justice that transcends politics and time. The British had their share of legendary operations, but this one was different. It was human to its core. From that day, Mossad ceased to be merely an intelligence service. It became a symbol, a quiet promise to the world that memory itself could be protected. And yet, success carries its own shadow. The agency had proven its reach, its courage, its precision. But now the world was watching. Every operation from that day onward would bear the weight of that legend. Still, in the quiet rooms of Tel Aviv, Isaharo sat one evening long after the mission's end. His office dimly lit, a glass of tea beside him. Untouched, he said nothing for a long while. Then, almost to himself, he whispered, "We did not capture a man. We captured a son." And in that moment, the heart of Mossad and the very soul of modern espionage found its rhythm. For in the stillness between justice and memory, the true work of the spy begins. And so, as the night deepened once more, their journey moved quietly forward. The Cold War mirage. The Cold War did not roar. It whispered. It stretched like a twilight that never ended. No dawn, no dusk. Just a constant, humming tension that blanketed the earth in that strange half-light. Mossad and MI6 found themselves walking the same path, sometimes together, sometimes apart, but always in shadow. The old world had fallen away. Empires had dissolved. Borders had shifted. And yet a new kind of empire was rising, one built not on land or armies, but on information. Every piece of intelligence became a currency, every whisper a weapon. And the best spies were no longer soldiers, but illusionists. For MI6, the post-war years were a test of reinvention. The betrayal of the Cambridge Five had left scars that still throbbed beneath the surface. The agency had lost not just secrets, but certainty, the quiet confidence that its walls were impenetrable. And yet, in that loss, MI6 learned something profound. That paranoia could be a kind of clarity. They began to rebuild, slower, quieter, more deliberate. The art of espionage shifted from grand gestures to delicate maneuvers. Gone were the days of trench coats and typewriters. This was the era of dead drops, code words, and misdirection so subtle it could pass for coincidence. London became the stage of invisible theatre. Meetings took place in parks where the pigeons were the only witnesses. Agents memorized cover stories so convincing they could dream. Messages were hidden in newspapers, photographs, and innocuous letters. MI6 became, once again, a master of patience, a listener in the static. They watched Moscow, Washington, Beijing, the three great storms circling the globe. But beneath that vast game, they also listened to smaller tremors, the rise of new nations, the fall of old ones, the shifting loyalties of those caught in between. And in that quiet undercurrent, they found a familiar companion, Mossad. By the 1960s, Israel had become a nation, both young and weak. Every victory carried the shadow of new threats. The Six-Day War loomed on the horizon, and the world of espionage became a battlefield of its own. Mossad's role expanded from defender to orchestrator, from watcher to influencer, where MI6 dealt in diplomacy and patience, Mossad thrived in precision. Their agents operated not from castles or embassies, but from rented flats and hidden rooms, using nothing but instinct and conviction. The Cold War's mirage had no clear enemies, only shifting alliances. The Soviet Union supplied Israel's neighbors, while the United States provided aid and hope. Mossad stood at the crossroads of these tensions, gathering intelligence from both sides, understanding that neutrality was a luxury they could never afford. And yet, beneath the steel of strategy, there was something profoundly human. Many of Mossad's agents were still children of war, survivors who understood loss better than life itself. They carried no illusions about ideology. To them, the Cold War was not a political chessboard. It was a storm that might, at any moment, consume their fragile nation. Still, within that uncertainty, they found brilliance. Mossad developed a gift for adaptation, blending espionage with psychology, strategy with empathy. They knew how to read people, how to listen to the tremor in a voice or the hesitation in a handshake. They became artists of human truth. Meanwhile, MI6 was mastering a different art, deception layered upon deception. They created double agents who became triple agents. They fed false information so elegantly that entire governments were misled without ever realizing it. And through it all, Britain's quiet voice still mattered, the old empire whispering through the new order. In those years, the bond between Mossad and MI6 deepened in the most delicate way, never declared, rarely documented, but real. They shared intelligence through veiled channels, warned each other of threats, and occasionally saved each other's operatives. Trust in espionage is a rare currency, and they traded it carefully. One story, never fully confirmed, but always whispered, tells of an MI6 officer who quietly warned Mossad about an assassination plot targeting an Israeli diplomat in Europe. Mossad returned the favor years later by uncovering a Soviet mole buried deep within a British network. Neither agency spoke of it publicly. They didn't need to. In their world, gratitude lived in silence. But the Cold War was not just fought in Europe, bled into deserts, jungles, and oceans, from the Suez Canal to the mountains of Afghanistan. Mossad learned to move through these global corridors like wind, unseen but felt. MI6, ever watchful, sometimes followed their trail, sometimes cleared it, together, though rarely in sight of one another. They built the architecture of modern espionage, an invisible alliance of purpose amid chaos. Yet there was a cost. For every operation completed, another layer of secrecy grew between the agents and the world they protected. They began to live not in nations, but in identities. Not in homes, but in shadows. One MI6 officer once wrote in a coded letter, "We are ghosts pretending to be men." And a Mossad operative, decades later, echoed the same thought in his diary. "We live so others may sleep." The Cold War was their proving ground, a silent war of nerves and patience. And though neither side ever declared victory, both MI6 and Mossad emerged transformed. They had learned that espionage was no longer about nations, but about humanity, about preventing catastrophe in a world too fragile to bear it. The Cold War ended as it began, not with a bang, but a breath. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Empire dissolved, and the world woke to a new kind of uncertainty. For a moment, it seemed as though the shadows might fade, but the watchers knew better. Every ending is only the beginning of another silence. And so, as the walls came down and new powers rose, Mossad and MI6 stepped into a new century, one filled not with clear enemies, but with invisible ones. The mirage had ended, but the night was far from over, and as the world shifted beneath them, their journey moved quietly forward. The art of the impossible. There are moments in history that seem almost unreal, moments that belong more to dreams than to the waking world. And yet they happen, carried out by people who never sought glory, never asked for praise, and whose names, more often than not, were never known. In the long twilight that followed the Cold War, Mossad and MI6 found themselves facing a new kind of world, one fractured, unpredictable, and vast. The rules of espionage were changing, and survival demanded something extraordinary: imagination. For both agencies, the impossible was no longer a boundary. It was a challenge. Mossad, forged in necessity, began to take on missions that seemed beyond reason, not because they could, but because they must. There was no luxury of hesitation. In their world, the window between knowledge and danger was often just seconds wide. One such mission unfolded in 1976, long before the Cold War had cooled, but its echoes stretched across generations. The rescue at Entebbe, a passenger plane had been hijacked by terrorists and flown to Uganda. On board were more than 100 hostages, many of them Israeli citizens. The world watched helplessly. Uganda's dictator, Idi Amin, welcomed the hijackers as guests. And in that stifling, humid airfield, time stood still. But not for Mossad. In the quiet offices of Tel Aviv, a plan began to form. Wild, reckless, and utterly impossible. Israeli commandos, guided by Mossad intelligence, would fly thousands of miles under radar, land in the dead of night, and free the hostages before dawn. Every detail mattered, every whisper, every photograph, every intercepted message became part of a fragile mosaic. Mossad agents on the ground gathered floor plans of the terminal, studied guard routines, and mapped the faint hum of engines that never slept. On July 4th, the night sky above Entebbe rippled with silence. 3 Israeli aircraft, blacked out against the stars, descended like shadows. Within minutes, the commandos stormed the terminal, calling out in Hebrew, "Down." Israeli soldiers. It lasted just over half an hour. When the sun rose, 102 hostages were free. One Israeli officer, Yonatan Netanyahu, was gone, but his courage became legend. The world called it a miracle. Mossad called it duty. And in that operation, the impossible was no longer a myth. It was a method, WWII, to face its own tests of the extraordinary. though their victories rarely reached headlines. Their quiet influence was woven through history like invisible thread. During the long, uncertain years of Middle Eastern tension, MI6 worked tirelessly behind the curtain, negotiating in silence, persuading where words failed, averting wars before the world even knew they were near. Their operations were not as dramatic as gunfire or rescues. They were quieter, but no less daring, false identities built over decades, secret communications that shaped peace treaties, invisible bridges between governments that refused to meet. The art of the impossible was not always action. Sometimes it was endurance. In the 1980s, when the world turned its eyes to nuclear threats and secret weapons, MI6 found itself once again at the edge of the unthinkable. Its agents infiltrated scientific circles, forged friendships that were covers for information, manned to read laboratories as one might read poems, with attention to silence and detail. And in Tel Aviv, Mossad was doing the same, uncovering clandestine weapons programs, dismantling networks of terror before they could ignite. Their agents moved through Europe and the Middle East under names that belonged to ghosts, their courage quiet, their victories unseen. There is a strange peace that comes from living on the edge of impossibility. For those who serve in silence, the world becomes sharper, more fragile. Every success feels fleeting, every mistake eternal. An MI6 officer once said in a letter never meant to be read, "We do not do this because we are brave. We do it because no one else can." And perhaps that is the heart of this chapter, that the impossible was never truly about daring. It was about necessity, the kind that leaves no choice but fall. In one forgotten Mossad operation, an agent once lived for years under a false identity, raising a family that would never know who he truly was. He died before he could return home. His mission succeeded. His story, like so many others, vanished into classified archive, but the world he helped protect, the small, fragile peace that endured, was his legacy. And so, Mossad and MI6 shared something sacred, an understanding that sometimes the most heroic acts are the quietest ones, the ones no one will ever know. To live that way, to move through the world unseen, to bend reality without ever touching it, is to become a kind of artist. The brush is patience, the canvas is chaos, the paint is truth, thinned and veiled, shaped into something that keeps the world from breaking. It is the art of the impossible, and yet, for every masterpiece, there is a shadow. Each operation carried a weight of secrecy, of loss, of the things they could never say. The burden of success was silence. The reward was to be forgotten. And still they continued. Because to stop was to let the world go blind. As the years drifted onward, the missions grew quieter, but the stakes grew higher. Terrorism began to replace ideology as the great enemy. Information moved faster. Secrets became harder to keep. And yet, both agencies adapted. They evolved as the world did, learning new languages, new technologies, new fears. But beneath it all, their essence remained unchanged. To listen, to act, to protect the world from what it does not yet know. And as dawn broke over new centuries, and the old ghosts of the Cold War faded, the impossible continued to call to them, not as an obstacle, but as a duty. Because for Mossad and MI6, impossibility was not where the story ended. It was where it always began. And so, as the night deepened once more, their journey moved quietly forward. Betrayal and redemption. In the world of shadows, the deepest wounds are not made by bullets, but by trust. It is a truth that every spy learns too late, that the same silence that protects you can also betray you. By the time the 1980s arrived, both MI6 and Mossad had seen their share of victories, but beneath the triumphs ran a quiet current of unease. For no matter how careful they were, no matter how intricate their networks, betrayal always found a way in. For MI6, the ghosts of the Cambridge Five had not yet faded. Kim Philby's shadow still lingered in the hallways of Whitehall, whispered about in late meetings and cautious briefings. Every new recruit was tested, questioned, studied not only for skill, but for soul. The betrayal of those once trusted had taught MI6 a painful truth. Intelligence work was not simply about knowing others, but knowing yourself. And yet, even as they rebuilt, more cracks appeared. A double agent named Jeffrey Prime leaked British secrets to the Soviets for years, hiding in plain sight as an unassuming translator. His betrayal was quiet. No shootouts, no drama, just words passed invisibly that tipped the balance of power again and again. For the men and women of MI6, each revelation of betrayal was like a slow, personal unraveling. They learned that loyalty could not be measured in background checks or oaths, but in the small, unseen choices one makes when no one is watching. And in Israel, Mossad was facing its own storms. It began with whispers, a compromised mission, a name leaked, a life lost because someone, somewhere, spoke too freely. The agency that had once seemed untouchable found itself questioning its own reflection. The 1980s were a dangerous time, filled with shifting alliances and emerging powers. Mossad had grown vast, intricate, and with that growth came risk. There was a man named Yehuda Gil, one of Mossad's brightest analysts. For decades, his information guided national decisions. But in the 1990s, the truth surfaced like a ghost from deep water. Much of his intelligence had been fabricated. Entire policies had been built upon illusion. It was not betrayal for money or ideology, but something stranger, a need to remain indispensable. His downfall was quiet, but its echo thundered. Mossad realized that even within its most trusted walls, illusion could thrive. The agency's strength, its ability to live in secrecy, was also its weakness. For when you live in a world of lies, even truth begins to blur. And yet, from this pain, both agencies found something powerful, a kind of grace. Betrayal, as cruel as it was, became the mirror that revealed what mattered most in the aftermath of deception. Both MI6 and Mossad chose not vengeance, but reflection. They redefined what trust meant. They learned to forgive carefully and to rebuild stronger. MI6 began to shift its culture, embracing not just the old guards of Oxford and Cambridge, but new voices, linguists, scientists, ordinary people with extraordinary instincts. They learned that loyalty sometimes comes not from privilege, but from purpose. Mossad, too, changed. It turned inward, re-evaluating its values. They introduced new systems of accountability, not to destroy secrecy, but to protect it, because they understood now that the truest danger did not come from the enemy outside, but from the silence within. Still, redemption in espionage is never simple. It does not come with apologies or closure. It comes in the form of service, in showing up again, in doing the work, in protecting others, even when the world has turned its back. There was one story, never confirmed but often told in whispers, of a Mossad agent who had once failed a mission that cost innocent lives. For years, he disappeared into quiet, unassuming exile. And yet, when a crisis erupted decades later, he returned without being asked, slipping back into the field with no promise of redemption, only duty. He did not seek forgiveness. He sought balance. In London, an MI6 officer once said, "Over a cup of coffee gone cold, we don't get to retire from ghosts. We only learn to walk beside them." It is perhaps the most human truth in the world of espionage, that beneath the codes and cover names, beneath the illusions and loyalties, every spy remains a human being, trying to make peace with what they've done and what they've lost. Betrayal and redemption, it seems, are not opposites. They are partners in the same quiet dance, one teaching humility, the other restoring faith. And as both agencies carried their lessons into a new age, something began to change. The world was no longer divided neatly between East and West. The Cold War's end had birthed a new kind of chaos, borderless, unpredictable, invisible. The spies of the 20th century became the watchers of the 21st. And though the stage had changed, the rhythm remained the same. Trust, betrayal, silence, and renewal. Mossad and MI6, tempered by loss and reborn in humility, stepped into the digital dawn with eyes wiser and hearts quieter. They knew that perfection was a myth, but vigilance was eternal. And so they moved forward, not as flawless legends, but as human guardians. Because in the end, the world does not need heroes. It needs listeners. It needs those who still choose to stand in the dark so others may sleep. And as the stars shifted over Tel Aviv and London alike, their journey, scarred, softened, and deeply human, moved quietly forward. The new age of shadows, the 21st century, did not arrive with thunder. It came in silence, in flickering computer screens, in invisible networks humming through cables under the sea, and the soft pulse of satellites circling above sleeping cities. For Mossad and MI6, the dawn of the digital age was both a gift and a ghost. The tools of espionage were changing faster than the world could understand. The old art's disguise, dead drops, invisible ink, were being replaced by something colder, quieter, infinitely more dangerous: data. The new enemy was not a man, or even a nation. It was everywhere. It was information itself in London. MI6's grand stone building on the Thames, once a fortress of paper, whispered, bend human intuition, filled with glowing screens and silent analysts who watched the world unfold in real time. They no longer listened only to men, but to machines. Algorithms began to whisper where informants once had. Every keystroke, every intercepted call, every flicker of satellite feed became a story waiting to be read. But beneath the hum of technology, the essence of espionage remained heartbreakingly human. The agents still carried the same burden, the quiet knowledge that one mistake, one overlooked silence, could change the fate of nations. Across the sea, Mossad faced the same transformation. The Middle East had entered a new kind of storm, one without clear fronts or flags. Terror networks moved like mist, flowing across borders and screens alike. To face them, Mossad had to become something even more fluid, more invisible. They learned to live inside the digital dark, to move through servers and encryption as once. They had moved through alleys and safe houses, but the most dangerous mission still required something no machine could mimic: empathy. To look into another's eyes and understand their fear. To sense deceit, not from data, but from silence. The new age blurred the line between watcher and watched. Drones replaced patrols. Satellites replaced scouts. But still, somewhere beneath the circuitry, there were men and women sitting in dim rooms, hearts beating too fast, hands trembling as they made decisions no one would ever know. The partnership between Mossad and MI6 deepened in this age, though rarely spoken of, rarely admitted. Information crossed oceans in encrypted streams, exchanged not through handshakes, but through code. The two agencies learned to move like reflections, separate, yet in rhythm. There were moments of quiet brilliance, when Mossad traced a cyber attack back to its source before it could cripple hospitals. When MI6 intercepted digital chatter that revealed plots meant to ignite cities. When together they unraveled networks of terror, not with bullets, but with bytes. And yet, with every success came unease. The digital world was too vast, too faceless. Enemies no longer wore uniform. They wore usernames. Identities became smoke. Truth became fluid, an MI6 officer once wrote. In a classified report, later declassified years later, we used to chase shadows. Now we chase reflections of shadows, and even those deceive us. It was a confession that echoed across continents. Mossad felt it too. That deep, gnawing uncertainty that technology had given them more eyes, but fewer hearts. The new spies no longer carried forged passports and pistols. They carried passwords and code, and yet they still woke at night with the same dreams of loss. bow of silence, of the thin thread of safety stretched too tight. But even in this shifting landscape, both agencies held to one enduring truth. The human mind was still the ultimate weapon. Technology could amplify it, but never replace it. Do the art of intuition, that quiet, inexplicable knowing, still guided every mission that mattered. And so, MI6 and Mossad adapted not by abandoning their humanity, but by refining it. They began to train agents who were both thinkers and dreamers, capable of reading code, but also emotion, capable of speaking to machines, but also to souls. In the digital night, espionage became a paradox, both infinite and intimate. A world where one message could ignite war, and one intercepted whisper could prevent it. The lines between defense and offense blurred, as both agencies ventured into the realm of preemptive action. Strikes carried out not with armies, but with information. Sabotage through silence. Victory through invisibility. But the digital world, for all its brilliance, lacked something the old spies knew well. Wait, the smell of danger, the heartbeat of proximity, the human presence. Somewhere deep inside both MI6 and Mossad, there remained a quiet yearning for the old craft, for the thrill of a face-to-face meeting, the tremor in a suspect's hand, the satisfaction of a code cracked by human insight. Not artificial logic, because, at their core, spies are storytellers. They gather fragments, decode patterns, and weave meaning from chaos. And in a world drowning in data, it is meaning, not information, that saves us. As the 21st century deepened, the world grew noisier, and the watchers learned a new kind of patience. They no longer looked for silence in sound, but for truth in noise. They learned to hear the heartbeat of danger buried in endless static. And through it all, Mossad and MI6 remained steady, not as relics of an older world, but as its conscience. They had become not just protectors of nations, but guardians of memory, the keepers of what humanity still means when everything else is electric. And so, as satellites passed quietly overhead, and servers hummed like mechanical oceans, the watchers kept watch, not for glory, not for power, but for peace, the kind so fragile it must be protected in silence. And as the digital night deepened, their journey moved quietly forward. The weight of silence. There comes a point after every storm when the air goes still. The waves stop breaking, the echoes fall away, and in that quiet, that pure, almost sacred quiet, you can finally hear what the world has been trying to say all along. For MI6 and Mossad, that silence was both burden and blessing. After a century of listening, deceiving, protecting, and surviving, both agencies found themselves standing in the reflection of all they had done. The wars they prevented, the lives they lost, the truths they carried, and the lies they had to tell in the dim corridors of Vauxhall Cross, where Messix's lights burn through the fog above the Thames. The silence is heavy. It hums through the floors, fills the elevators. lingers in the late-night offices where analysts study the world long after the rest of London sleeps. They know that the war never really ends. It only changes shape, and in Tel Aviv, in a quiet building with no sign and no name, the same silence breathes. It moves through the rooms like a memory, like the sigh of history itself. Mossad's agents come and go in that rhythm, steady, unspoken, eternal dot. Most will never be known. Their victories will be forgotten or claimed by others. Their failures will live only in the small hours of the night, when the weight of their choices comes to sit beside them in the dark. That is the weight of silence. It is not guilt. It is not pride. It is something deeper, the understanding that to protect life, one must sometimes step outside of it. To guard truth, one must sometimes speak in lies. Both MI6 and Mossad learned this long ago. And yet, even after decades of shadows, both remained deeply human. Their strength was never in their secrecy. It was in their quiet compassion, the love for a world they could never fully belong to, but could never abandon. There are moments, late at night, when an operative might stand on a balcony overlooking a city, London, Tel Aviv, Amman, Berlin, and listen to the hum of life below. People laughing, cars passing, music drifting through the windows of strangers. And for a moment, the agent allows themselves to feel it. The world they protect, so fragile, so unaware. It is in those moments that the silence becomes something else. Not a burden, not a punishment, but a prayer. Because to live as a shadow is not to disappear. It is to watch the world and love it, even when it can never love you back. Over time, the lines between the two agencies, the British Watchers and the Israeli Guardians, began to blur into something larger. They were no longer defined by borders, but by purpose. They had learned from each other, grown from each other, and in doing so, had reshaped the very soul of espionage. They had turned secrecy into art, listening into language, banned silence into sanctuary. The world around them continued to evolve, louder, faster, more chaotic than ever. But beneath the noise, the same quiet heartbeat persisted, the rhythm of vigilance, the soft pulse of unseen courage. Perhaps that is the legacy they leave behind. Not the missions, not the names, not even the victories, but the reminder that true guardianship is invisible, that the greatest acts of service are the ones the world never sees. There is a quiet dignity in that truth, a peace that does not need to be spoken. And if you listen closely, very closely, you can almost hear it now. The steady hum beneath history, the breath of those who watch unseen, while the rest of us dream in safety. Mossad and MI6, two names, two nations, one shadow stretching across a century. Together, they changed the face of espionage forever, not through domination or fear, but through devotion, through the calm persistence of those who chose to keep the world turning while remaining still. And so, as we come to the end of this long, quiet journey, we return to where we began, to the edge of night. where the unseen still moves softly among us, holding the fragile peace in careful hands. If these words have carried you gently through the dark, if they've brought you closer to rest, then let this silence linger with you a while longer, because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones whispered in the dark. And as the night deepens, the watchers keep watch still, unseen, unheard, forever awake. In the end, the world turns quietly. Empires rise, nations shift, and the night remains somewhere behind the glow of 1,000 screens. Pin offices without names, in safe houses that look like ordinary homes. Men and women still sit awake, watching, listening. Their hands never tremble, but their hearts do. Because to protect what is fragile, they must live where light cannot follow. The world will never know their faces. Their triumphs will pass without applause. Their failures buried beneath headlines that never mention their names. And yet, every morning when you wake to peace, to laughter, put to quiet, ordinary life, it is because somewhere unseen, someone chose the silence over the spotlight. Mossad and MI6. Two names carved not in marble, but in the spaces between history's breaths. They taught the world that intelligence is not about knowing. It is about understanding. It is about patience, power, love for truth, love for country, love for a world too fragile to stand alone. Theirs is not a legacy of power. It is a legacy of restraint, the art of holding the storm by and never letting it break. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, remember this: the quiet ones, the watchers, the guardians who walk unseen. They are still out there, still listening, protecting, still carrying the weight of silence so the rest of us may dream in peace. Good night.